All right, so far in this unit, we have gone through an article where we looked at what the article really was a music analysis writing article, is how to write about analyzing music, right? And we pulled out all the vocabulary from that also corresponds with art vocabulary. So some of the words that we found were words like these, right? So they are words that apply both to music and to art. And if you have musical training, that might seem maybe more obvious to you than if you don't have musical training. But either way, okay, there are some similarities, right? So music is composed in the same way that art is designed and created, right? There is a creative element to what you're doing when you're composing music and when you are designing and creating artworks, right? And then we can analyze both art and music in very similar ways. So not only are some of our words similar, but also the concepts in like what we are looking at tend to be pretty parallel, right? So for example, we looked at, in your music analysis sheets, we looked at things like the structure of the music. Are there sections that repeat? Are there sections that transition from one to the other? How do those sections differ? And we could say the same thing about various art pieces, right? Are there sections of the artwork that repeat, that feel related, that transition from one to the other? So a lot of it is really parallel, okay? So this unit, this project for us is our non-objective painting. We're gonna get into what all of that means. What I need to prepare you for though in the meantime is that this is very different way of thinking and processing and analyzing and evaluating than you may have ever done before, let alone from just what we just did, okay? And I realize and recognize that we're coming off of still life, which is a very observation dependent technique. It's very much about what you see. It's not as much about creativity and making creative decisions as it is about kind of really honing your visual skills. This is gonna kind of go almost a 180 from that. So we're gonna still use visual skills, but we're gonna use them in a totally opposite way, and we're gonna think in a very opposite way, maybe than you ever have. Okay, so these are our 4 guiding, leading questions that you want to kind of keep in the back of your mind as we go through the slides today. And then by the end of it, these are what you should be able to answer. So what is non-objective art? What does that even mean, right? Where did it come from? How is it related to music? And how are we going to create it? What are we actually going to create? So first of all, non-objective, basically when you break it down to the core of the words, it means it is not an object. So in other words, it's not representing an actual object or an actual figure or an actual scene, okay? It's not gonna look like anything specific, right? It's not gonna be recognizable to your audience. It's not gonna be representative of something. It's not gonna be symbolic of something. It is just nothing specific, okay? So you might be saying, well then, what is it, right? If it's not anything, if it's not an object, if it's nothing that represents something, then what do we do? Okay? It's a hard concept for some people to kind of wrap your head around because we're used to kind of associating things with other things. We're used to kind of putting a meaning on things or putting a memory maybe with something or something that we can kind of relate to, right? So the phrase, it is only what it is, right, kind of tells us that we are looking at the art for what we see, so it does kind of relate to still life, but in a totally different way. We're thinking of it as the pure aesthetic, and you guys were here when I was talking to Mr. Johnson the other day about that use of the word aesthetic, right? So when we're talking about aesthetic, we're talking about the idea that something can be aesthetically pleasing, right? So if something looks good, if it seems pleasing to our eye, right, that would be aesthetically pleasing. We can think of the definition of beauty as part of and related to that, but I think that something can be aesthetically pleasing and not be traditionally beautiful. I think that there's certainly some overlap there, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. What we do want to be in this term aesthetically pleasing is we do want to have some active composition in order to engage our viewers. Because we're not engaging our viewers with something that is symbolic or something that has a particularly specific meaning, and we're not engaging them with something that they're going to recognize. So how do we engage them? Well, we're going to use these formal elements of design. When I say formal, I mean in the sense of the forms of art, right? So line, shape, color, texture, value, right? The elements of design. So we're going to use those kind of root elements in order to create visuals that become active composition, that are going to lead the viewer's eye around the composition in ways that are engaging, in ways that maybe create some sense of movement, at least to kind of lead the eye, and then there's something there to visually follow, okay? And in that way, we're using our design principles in order to create this idea of something that is aesthetically pleasing, that looks good, right? I'm using giant air quotes because that's a very vague term, okay? Questions so far? Okay, so we know our elements of design are line, shape, color, texture, and value. So when we look, I feel like I'm in the way, like because of this table. When we look at this particular artwork, which is a non-objective artwork, right? Where do we see line used, for example? Give me one example of where you see line.
Would it be like the scratch marks?
The scratch marks. So you're talking about like these little...
Yeah, like all over.
You could call those line, yeah. They definitely have the effect of lines, right? And that would be language that you could use also. So even if you're not sure if something is like, if it qualifies as a something, right? Because non-objective work is traditionally hard to talk about because it's so non-specific, right? So a way that you can kind of get around that is you can speak of in effects, right? So it has the effect of a line, even if we're not sure it really, you know, by definition qualifies as a line. That works. What effect do those lines have in this artwork? They do what for the viewer? Yep.
Like the lighter area on the blue, you can see like it's like hinting that like it's kind of like a circle, like in the corner there.
Mm-hmm. So in that case, that what is having the effect of those lines is kind of giving the viewer a sense of maybe another shape or another direction to kind of lead their eye to create some movement or some activity. Those are all good things. Yep, good. What else? Anything else that those lines do? Yep.
They create activity around the main piece. They center your focus.
Yes. So you mentioned a lot of really good things in that one comment. So we have kind of a central focus where there's a lot of activity kind of, not in the exact center, but more towards the center, right? But then in those more subtle, less active areas, those little subtle lines create more activity, so it balances with that heavier area of activity towards the center, and so that it draws your eye back to those areas. Did I get it all? Okay, good. Anything else for line? Other lines that you notice or that stand out to you? Okay. How about shape? I feel like shape is a big one. Where do we see shapes? Yep.
Looks like there's like a large cross because
It looks like there's a large cross. Tell me more about that. I interrupted you.
Because most of like the, what is it, warmer colors
Mm-hmm.
seem to like form the shape of a cross.
Do you guys see what she's talking about? So when we look at all these shapes together, we feel, right, that they kind of form the shape or the form of a cross, right? By the way, the difference between shape and form is shape is two-dimensional, form is three-dimensional, or the effect of 3D. So they're somewhat interchangeable if you want to be like, you know, dictionary definition standard, right? So yeah, so all of those little sections of color, you refer to the warm colors. So the oranges, the reds, the browns, the purples, right? They, when you look at them all together, form, they have the effect of, right, the shape of a cross, right? Is it like super hit you over the head obvious? No. And technically speaking, does a non-objective work need to have that? No. Okay, this one just happens to. So yes, that's good. Anything else with shape? Something else to think about, we can use the word shape and the word space in very, very similar ways. They are very, very closely related. If you think like within a family, they'd be like siblings, okay? So a shape doesn't have to have like hard defined edges or lines in order to define where that shape starts and ends. So you could think of a space or an area as having the effect of a shape, much like we said things could have the effect of lines, right? So we could refer to like this kind of patch of lighter blue as a shape, right? We could refer to kind of this area of, say, reddish, right, as a shape, okay? So our definition of the word shape is going to get a little looser on this one because we are thinking and working non-objectively. It's a little bit different mindset, right? Okay, how about color? Izzy, you want to riff off of what you said before?
Oh, there's a lot of warms in the front and a lot of cools in the back.
There's a lot of warm colors in the front and there's a lot of cool colors in the back. So even though there are not like large flat areas of color, we still get the sense that we have this, you know, kind of one area, again, more air quotes, with warm colors that kind of makes it feel related and connected. And then we have this sense of background where there are cool colors, okay? And there is not one area or one color that's just painted flat. We see lots of kind of subtle colors mixed in. We see lots of gradients. We see some hard edges, but lots and lots of subtle mixing between colors, right? But in general, we can summarize that it has the effect of warm colors, cool colors, right? Other things that stand out to you with color?
I was gonna say like, I guess like the so-called cross. I feel like that like pops out of the paper compared to the background.
So that's a really good thing to notice. It does that for two main reasons, okay? First of all, it is an actual, like it is sculpted away from the surface of the canvas. So it's not a flat canvas, it actually is what's called a relief, which means it's three-dimensional, okay? Like coins are relief, like if you rub your thumb across a coin, you feel the surface levels, right? Ours are gonna be much more depth and sculpted than a coin would be. So this actually does have like actual height and actual texture. But even if it was totally flat, we would still get that sense because of what? Anybody have a guess? What gives it that effect? What makes that cross part kind of advance?
Is it like the black in the warm, like with, okay, so like the cool color in the background kind of has black, and then there's black like in the cross area, and then there's also like white. I don't know.
It's
The
less
balance
about the
of
black and the white, but it is about the warm and the cool.
Okay.
So warm colors, I'm speaking in generalizations here, not 100% of the time, but generally speaking, warm colors tend to advance towards the viewer. They tend to feel like they're coming towards you. Cool colors tend to recede towards the background, okay? And that's because we are used to seeing that if you think about what's outside, right? Sky, atmosphere, things that are farther away appear more cool colored because of the atmospheric perspective and looking through those particles. You guys learned that with your landscape unit, right? And then things that are warmer colored, okay, unless it is sunset or a very warm colored time of day, we're gonna see more warm colored things closer to us because we're not looking through as much of that atmospheric particle perspective. Does that make sense? Okay. Again, that's not 100% of the time, that's not to say that you can't have warm colors in your background, but it's just gonna, putting cool colors in the background and warm colors in the foreground is gonna help exaggerate depth in the traditional sense of how we are used to perceiving things. Okay, good observation. Anything else about color? If you think back to your color schemes, there's a lot of analogous color happening here. So like we said, like this is blue, it reads as blue, but what's making up that blue? There's some teal, there's some white, there's some purple, right? It's like a wider slice of the color wheel that was analogous neighbor colors, right? Same thing with the warm colors in those areas, right? So we have reds, oranges, and purples, and yellows even in some areas, right? So sometimes it's a pretty wide analogous section. Some cases it's a little narrower analogous section. Are you okay over there? But the idea is that there's mixing of colors together. It's not just one flat, solid color. Okay, questions? Make sense? Okay, how about texture? How does this artist use texture?
To like have the effect of like a line like on the bottom left.
So a lot of this texture, these kind of wrinkles, which are actual wrinkles in the surface, right? They create the effect of lines with the way that the surface is kind of folded over itself. Good. What else?
It almost looks kind of like Mod Podges. Like, I don't know, like the paper where you like get it wet, it kind of looks like that.
Like paper mache?
Yeah.
It is, that surface is built up that way. Yeah. So it's layered areas on the surface that are kind of built on top of each other and formed over each other. So we are going to build up our structure with things like cardboard and rolled up paper towels first. We're going to kind of build a structure, and then we're going to build a surface over the top, right? That's going to kind of use that structure as the base, and then the surface is going to be what we paint on eventually. So it's very mixed media. We're mixing a whole bunch of different materials together. We are creating the surface that we're going to paint upon, but because we have so much control over that, we get to control what areas have more texture, what areas are smoother. Okay, are there smooth areas in here?
Like the four corners.
The four corners are a little smoother, right? So it's kind of as it comes in from the edge, okay, and this is just one particular example, the texture gets more aggressive, right? And then as it moves out towards the edges, that texture gets more subtle, more smooth, okay? So that's another way that this artist activates that surface. If it didn't have all that texture on the outside, it would be flat. There wouldn't be anything there to kind of keep your eye engaged, to keep your eye moving, right? So non-objective really relies on these little subtle ways to activate surface. It's almost like little treats for your eye, kind of not hidden, but distributed throughout, so that your eye doesn't get bored. It doesn't have like flat areas to kind of lose your attention. It gives you little things to look at and to find and to explore, and then to keep moving your eye throughout the composition. Questions? Okay. How about value? You talked about value a little bit.
Is value like, wait, is that like contrasting kind of?
Mm-hmm. Value is lights and darks.
Yeah.
So contrast can
So,
be
like,
made from value. Yep.
There's like purple and then there's like red by it. I don't know if that has.
So would purple and red be a low contrast pair or a high contrast pair?
Low.
Yes,
Because
because they're close to each other. Exactly. So it mixes some low contrast with some areas of high contrast, right? You picked out before that there was like black and white,
Yeah.
right? Or very, very dark and very, very light colors. Okay, so there's kind of a mix. Yep.
There's more emphasis on the actual shape itself because there's white on it and the
Mhm.
background has like edges of black on it.
Yes. So we see more lighter values in that kind of central shape area, and then there's more darker values in the background. Why would an artist use, photography students, this is going to be obvious to you, why would an artist use more light values in the subject, the central area, and more dark values in the background? Yep.
Because they wanted to stand out.
Because they want it to stand out. And what is your eye going to be more attracted to? Light values or dark values?
Light values.
Light values. Generally speaking, right? Nailed it. Anything else about value? Is this making sense? Okay. Value is also necessary in order to show depth, that relief, the texture, the dimension of the surface, right? If the light shining on this was so flat that we couldn't see any shadows, would we know that there was texture there? Probably not, right? Definitely not as much as we see from the value. So value is going to be in what you're painting. You're going to be painting highlights and shadows and lights and darks, but you're also going to have to think about how does actual light from the actual environment fall upon your surface of your non-objective painting in a way that makes things appear more obvious, right? Easier to see, more intentional, so that you can actually see, or your viewer can actually see the texture that you're creating. Make sense? Okay, it's a little bit It's a lot more to think about. It's a different way for your brain to process. Okay, so what of these can we answer? What is non-objective art? Yeah.
Art that has like no object or main focus.
It can have a main focus, but no object, right? Nothing recognizable. Do we know where it came from? It's not yet.
Imagination.
Well, yes. But we can be more specific. We'll get some more specifics about that. Do we know how it's related to music yet? Sort of. We talked about vocab, right? We can use some parallel words and some parallel ways to look at it, right? Points of view. And we know a little bit about how we are going to create it. We'll add to that. So you may have heard the term abstract when we refer to art, right? And non-objective and abstract can sometimes be used interchangeably, but I want you to understand the difference so you can use terms accurately. So we said that non-objective means that it uses lines, shapes, colors, textures, and values. So those elements of art, we call those the formal elements, right? To suggest a feeling. Okay? It's not meant to show an object at all. The fact that that one happened to look like a cross technically is not non-objective. So non-objective doesn't have to refer to anything. In fact, it shouldn't refer to anything. Okay? So it's focusing on like the pure elements of art in their most formal of senses. When I say formal, I mean, again, like the forms of art, not like black tie formal. Okay? Abstract also uses line, shapes, colors, textures, and values, but abstract can be a little bit more recognizable. It can refer to something. It can be representational, okay? But typically abstract is not realistic looking, right? So like a really stylized version of like a cartoon character we would call abstract, right? So like we can tell it's a dog, but it's not a realistic dog, but non-objective, we wouldn't see a dog at all. Does that make sense? Okay. So where this goes is we can relate this to abstract expressionism, which is a form of art. It's a historical form of art. You guys might be familiar with Jackson Pollock, right? Jackson Pollock was an abstract expressionist artist. And so he was using lines, shapes, colors, textures, values to express, in his case, movement. That was kind of his focus. These canvases that he was working on, he would have them on the floor, and they would be like the size of a room, and he would be on the canvas kind of flinging things around, right, using gravity, using movement, and his point was that all of those little details and curves and splotches and stuff are technically recording or documenting the way the artist moved when they created it. Question?
Is that where the Pollock painting comes from? Like,
This is Pollock.
No, I know, but I've heard the term like a Pollock painting.
Yeah, Pollock painting means like you're referring to like splattery, doesn't look like anything. Yep, that's where this comes from, Jackson Pollock. Good question. So Autumn Rhythm is a really more famous Jackson Pollock painting. Now, just because it's splattery doesn't mean it's Jackson Pollock. Okay, we'll see if we get time. There's a documentary that we can watch where a woman finds a painting in a thrift store that somebody tells her might be a Jackson Pollock, and they go through this process of trying to figure out if it is or if it isn't. It's really, there are some real characters in that documentary. Well, I'll see if we can have time to watch that. But that is what he is known for. That is what that art style is known for, abstract expressionism. Okay. Other abstract expressionists, there's him working in his studio. That's his wife, who is also an artist. I love how she's just like sitting on her little stool perch, just like supervising, right? I believe you can still tour some of his studio space in, I can't remember where he's from now, I'm blanking. But they had like areas where you could tour, obviously paint everywhere, right? So another abstract expressionist artist is Vasily Kandinsky, okay? Totally from different areas of the world, right? Totally different approach, but still non-objective artwork, right? So no specific recognizable subject. We're using those basic formal elements, line, shape, color, texture, value. Subtle use here of color. So the background and even some of the shapes do seem flatter, okay? But when you look more in depth, there's a lot of use of gradients, okay, subtle, very low contrast gradients, but still gradients. So like a real obvious one is this blue, where it's blue here and then it kind of fades out. So Kandinsky is also really pushing the boundaries of what is a shape. He's using more of that idea of areas and not necessarily hard-edged shapes, although he does use plenty of those as well, right? But he's kind of using like these open forms, these open areas where we still get the effect of a shape, but it doesn't necessarily have like that cartoon edge all the way around it. Does that make sense? Okay. When you guys are working with coming from the idea of music, if you think about how music sometimes fades in and fades out, the volume, right? That might be a way that you can kind of approach that visually and translate that into visuals, is to use your gradients like that, use those blends. So this is another Kandinsky, less of a flat background on this, still some interplay of smaller areas of flatter shapes, but lots and lots of gradients, some more subtle than others, right? Okay, now Kandinsky was a Russian artist, and then Schoenberg here is a Viennese composer. So right now, this is like head-to-head artist versus musician, okay? But Kandinsky was inspired by Schoenberg and by his musical compositions and how he put music together. So Schoenberg was known for musical compositions called atonal music, okay? Now you guys are used to hearing music, maybe pop music, maybe rap, maybe country, maybe whatever genre you like, right? Atonal is like on another planet compared to the genres that you are most likely used to, okay? Atonal is the music equivalent of non-objective art. So atonal music does not have like a traditional melody in the sense that a song might have a melody that you can easily distinguish or latch onto. It does not have repeating patterns in the way that you might be used to. It's like a totally, totally different beast. And artists like Kandinsky were really inspired by that. They thought that was really interesting. That led them to think about creating in different ways, and that's how we got some of Kandinsky's non-objective pieces. Okay, so we're gonna listen to just a little bit of atonal music so you can hear how different it is, okay? And then if you want, now this is sheet music, right? These are music staffs. The blue line is gonna move across, and then as the blue line crosses the little note heads, which are the little dots or little circles, you can kind of look at where there's more dots, there's more notes happening. Where there's fewer dots, there are fewer notes happening. So what are you noticing?
It's like a scary vibe. I don't know.
So we get the feeling and the emotions from it, but we don't get the sense of a traditional melody, right? You wouldn't sing along with something like this. Some people say it sounds a little like a movie soundtrack, like it could have some activity happening with it. So we get that sense of activity, that sense of movement. We get the sense of dynamic changes, right? But we don't know what to expect. We don't have that sense of pattern that traditional music has, where it has a beat that seems familiar or seems predictable, right? It's a lot of unpredictable happening. Make sense? That's all. Okay, so do we have any more information that we can add to our guiding questions. Where did non-objective art come from? That guy who did what?
Who painted someone else's like music?
Yeah, he was inspired by music, and that was what drove his designs in his paintings, right? And this was the kind of music, I can't vouch for this particular song, but this was the kind of music that inspired that kind of painting, right? If you go on YouTube and you type in atonal music, there's 1,000 examples out there. I wanted to find one that had the guide like on the music so that you could kind of see what was happening. I had a better example years ago, and that video must not exist anymore, unfortunately. But that was kind of where it came from, was that idea of musical composition. Good. So now I'm going to introduce to you a new concept called synesthesia, and this is why it was important that we play that game yesterday. So synesthesia is the blending of senses. So what are our 5 senses?
Taste,
Taste,
smell,
smell, touch,
hear.
hearing, sound,
Sight.
right? Yeah,
Sight.
hearing.
Oh, yeah.
And sight, right? We're visual artists and we left sight till last. Good job. So sensory perception of one kind, so like a sound, for example, can manifest itself as a sensory experience of another. Okay? This is gonna like melt your brain, potentially, if you are not used to this concept. It takes a little while to kind of wrap your brain around, okay? So in other words, when we did the Dr. Hugh game yesterday, we were associating color with a word, okay? So technically a word is like a verbal thing, right? It could be a visual thing if you're looking at it. But to associate a color with it is blending of 2 senses that don't normally, right, have a relationship or a correspondence, okay? There are people, synesthetics, right? There are people that experience synesthesia in other ways. So for example, there might be people that associate specific letters with specific sounds or with specific colors. So for them, the letter A is always whatever color, or the number 7 is always whatever color, and they have this really strong association, right? It doesn't obviously happen with everyone, and there are a number of ways that people can experience synesthesia. Sometimes it's letters and sounds, or sometimes it's colors and numbers, or sometimes it is other senses. So maybe certain letters or certain numbers might have a particular taste for them, or a particular like audio sound that they associate it with. It's kind of an interesting concept. And that's another thing that if you want to look more into that, if that interests you, there's a lot of documented examples and people talking about that you can find. It's really interesting. Okay, so in our music analysis sheets, we looked at songs and we evaluated their structure, their instruments, their mood, their flow, and their volume. And we know that in non-objective art, we are working with the formal elements, line, shape, color, texture, and value. These parallel each other. So how would you pair them up? What would you associate structure in music with? Which one of these art terms? Yep.
Shape.
Shape, definitely. So we see the different structures, how we can kind of subdivide that song in the same way we can kind of subdivide a composition in art into different shapes or different areas or spaces. Remember, we can use those terms interchangeably, right? How about instruments? Yep.
Color.
Color would be a good one for that.
For volume.
You could talk about instruments in terms of, wait, you said volume. So do you mean color with volume?
No, I meant instruments and volume.
Oh, yeah, the instruments do have volume, so that is something that you listen for, right? Let's come back to that one. How about mood?
You could put that with flow and volume.
So which
Like
one
your-
of these would you associate mood with?
You can only do one.
Yes, for right now, for the purpose of this slide.
Okay, then I would do flow.
No.
Mood with which one from over
The
here?
other side.
Oh!
Now you got it.
Mood and, oh gosh,
Which of these would you associate with mood?
color.
Yes. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, the flow of music, what would you associate with on the right side?
Shape.
How it flows
Or
from one.
texture. Line.
Line.
You could do line, you could do texture. I could see how they would go with both. And then volume in music would be associated with
Value.
value, lights and darks. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, we determined, I think pretty clearly with our discussion, that there's not necessarily like only one thing that it will be associated with. You certainly could have some overlap, but this is a good starting point for when it comes to translating what you hear into what you will see or what your viewers will see, what you'll create for your viewers to see. Does that make sense? Okay? This is where your brain is thinking in new ways, and you're creating some new neural pathways and connections and ways for your brain to actually think about that stuff. Okay? So use this as your starting point. We're going to stop there for today. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about John Cage. John Cage is like a whole different, like if you think atonal music is weird, John Cage is a step beyond into what is unusual and unique and different. Okay? So we'll stop there for today. We'll pick it up tomorrow.
Is that it?
How much longer do we have for the last?
443.